Bodo woke up before the sun did, and the first thing he checked wasn't the weather, it was the fire. In a Frankish peasant house in the 9th century, there was no chimney, just a ring of stones on a dirt floor and a hole in the thatch above it. That fire stood between his family and a European winter. But it was also every single night the thing most likely to kill them. By the end of this, you'll know why a word you use today began as an order to smother it before bed. Historians reconstruct Bodo's life from something unusually specific for the period. It's called the Polyptyque of Erminon, an estate ledger kept by the monks of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, listing what peasant households like his owed in rent, labour and produce. From records like that one, spread across medieval Europe, we know roughly what his winter looked like. It starts with smoke, and it gets worse from there. Picture the house first. One room, maybe two if the family had done well by local standards, walls of wattle and daub packed over a timber frame, a roof of thatch pulled low toward the eaves to shed rain and snow. In the centre of the floor sat a shallow pit lined with stones, and in that pit, a fire that had been burning in some form for months. Peasant households guarded that flame the way you'd guard a bank account because flint, steel and dry tinder were a worse trade than simply feeding the coals through the night and never letting them fully die. So the fire sat there all winter, breathing smoke straight up into the rafters, with nowhere built to take it away. There was no flue to pull that smoke out cleanly. It drifted up, pooled under the roof, and found its way out however it could, through a louvered opening in the thatch, through the straw itself, through the gaps around the doorframe. You'd learn fast to duck low if you wanted a clean breath. Grander halls sometimes had a proper smoke hole with a louver you could angle against the wind. Most peasant houses just trusted the thatch to filter it out over time, and the smoke did something nobody would guess from the discomfort alone. It killed the insects living in the roof and cured the meat hanging from the rafters. It waterproofed the straw over your head, preservation and misery off the same fire. You would smell that house before you ever saw it. Wood smoke works its way into wool, into hair, into the grain of a wooden bowl, and it doesn't leave. Bodo's cloak carried it. His wife Ermentrude's cooking pots carried it, layer on layer, season after season. It's the smell historians say defined the inside of an entire continent for hundreds of years, and it came with a cost nobody wrote into the rent ledger. The same haze that kept the thatch pest-free was filling human lungs every day, all winter. There was no version of this life where you simply opted out. And the smoke was only the mild part of the problem, because once the sun went down, the real trade-off started. Bodo's day didn't end at dusk so much as it folded inward. Outside there was still work. Oxen to check on. Wood to split down to a size that would actually fit the hearth. Water to fetch before the well iced over. He and a younger worker named Guido did much of it together, and by the time the light was gone, both of them were glad to get back inside a room that, whatever else was wrong with it, was warmer than the yard. Wool did the rest of the job clothing couldn't. Peasants layered what they had, a rough wool tunic against the skin, another over it, a cloak pinned at the shoulder, and at night whatever furs or extra wool the household owned got piled on top of the sleepers rather than worn. Clothes doubled as bedding once the sun set, because there was no such thing as owning something that only had one job. Sleep itself was communal and not by sentiment. Straw pallets went down directly on packed earth close to the fire, and the whole family piled onto them together under wool and fur. Children wedged between adults because body heat cost nothing and firewood did. Nobody in Bodo's world slept alone by choice in the coldest months. In parts of northern Europe, families pushed that same logic one step further and brought the livestock inside. The longhouse design, found from Iceland to Wales to Scandinavia, put people at one end of the building and cattle at the other, sometimes separated by nothing more than a low wooden partition. It looked strange to later centuries, cattle and children breathing the same air, but the arithmetic behind it was simple. One estimate puts the heat a single cow gives off at roughly what you'd get from a small 1 kilowatt fire running all night for free, as long as someone mucked out the stalls by morning. Where you'd flip a switch and warm a room in seconds, they kept a herd of them breathing patiently through a wall. Even stacked 3 deep under wool with a cow's body heat leaking through the partition, the cold still won some nights. Chilblains, the itching, swollen sores that come from warming half-frozen fingers and toes too fast at the fire, show up across medieval medical writing often enough that they read as an ordinary winter complaint, not a rare misfortune. You lived with the itch the same way you lived with the smoke, constantly. Without much expectation, it should be otherwise. Before we get to food, there's the darkness to deal with, because in a Frankish winter, the sun barely bothers showing up. Daylight in that part of Europe can shrink to 8 hours or less in December, and every one of those hours that wasn't spent working was spent close to the one light source the house had: the fire. Real candles made from beeswax were a luxury Bodo's household didn't have much use for. What most peasant homes burned instead was the rushlight, a reed dipped and redipped in animal fat, until it held enough to burn for a short while, smoking, guttering, throwing off barely more light than the coals already did. So the evenings collapsed into a small, dim, smoky circle around the hearth, everyone within arm's reach of everyone else, mending tools, spinning wool, telling the same stories, because there was nowhere brighter to go and no reason to go there. Where you'd flip a switch and light an entire room, they fed a strip of fat-soaked reed and hoped it lasted through the mending. That closeness had a cost of its own. Bathing in winter meant heating water over the same fire that was already stretched thin doing everything else, so it happened rarely. And clothes that doubled as bedding rarely got washed either. Lice were not a shameful secret in Bodo's world. They were close to a given, mentioned in period sources with the same resignation as bad weather. You picked at them by firelight the way you'd mend a torn seam, one more small maintenance task in a life built almost entirely out of small maintenance tasks. None of it was pleasant. All of it was ordinary. The background hum of getting through a season, nobody had any way to skip. Now put the cold, the dark, and the itch in a room with hunger, because staying warm and staying lit all winter took fuel. And fuel in Bodo's world was also food, and all three were running off the same fixed account. By midwinter, almost everything a household had was already decided back in autumn. The harvest was threshed and stored, the pig was slaughtered and salted down, and from that point forward, you were spending a balance with no way to top it up until spring. Meals centered on pottage, a thick grain and vegetable stew that hung over the fire for days at a stretch, refreshed with whatever was on hand, eaten alongside dark bread made from rye, barley, or oats. Meat wasn't a daily food, even for a household as reasonably provisioned as Bodo's. It was salted pork, doled out carefully, saved for the handful of feast days scattered through the calendar, the days when the whole village might pool what it had. And for one evening, eating actually felt like a celebration instead of a chore. Historians estimate a peasant might get through a pound or two of bread a day, stretched with pottage and thin ale. And that was the normal version of the year, not the hard one. The hard version came later, in the stretch farmers called the hungry gap, the weeks of late winter and early spring when autumn stored grain was running thin and nothing new had grown yet. The bread got darker and coarser, the pottage thinned out, stretched with roots and whatever hardy greens could be scraped from under old snow. In a bad year, that gap didn't close in time, and a household had to gamble the seed grain it needed for spring planting against the food it needed to survive the winter that came before the planting. Guess wrong in either direction, and you'd either starve before the ground thawed, or have nothing left to plant once it did. Bodo's household paid rent and labour to the monastery that held their land, not cash. So a lean autumn didn't just mean a lean winter for the family, it meant the obligations still came due while the grain store shrank, and there was no version of the arrangement where the monks quietly forgave a bad harvest. The ledger that lets historians reconstruct his life at all is, in a sense, the same document that would have recorded exactly what he still owed, no matter how thin the hungry gap got. Against all of that, the village found its counterweight where it could. A feast day meant meat that wasn't rationed for once, ale that flowed a little more freely, music if anyone had the energy for it after a day like every other day. It wasn't lavish by any standard we'd recognize, but next to months of the same pottage, it felt like one. Warmth against the fire, then the cold fact of the hungry gap. A shared feast, then back to counting what was left in the grain store. The whole winter moved like that, one hard fact after another with just enough small relief scattered through it to keep a household going. So added up. Smoke in your lungs every day of the season. Chilblains on your hands from a fire that never quite reaches every corner of the room. A house shared with animals that keep you alive by breathing near you all night. And a diet that thins out exactly when the cold is doing its worst work on the body. All of that, families like Bodo's absorbed and survived, year after year, as the ordinary texture of a peasant winter. But there was one danger that outranked every item on that list. One thing that could turn a hard winter into a catastrophe inside of a single night. And it wasn't the frost, and it wasn't the hunger. It was the fire itself. Think about what that house actually was. Structurally, for a second, a timber frame, walls of wattle and daub packed with straw and mud, a roof of dry thatch sitting directly above an open flame that had been burning, largely unmonitored, for months on end. One strong gust down the smoke hole, one log rolling the wrong way while the household slept, and the exact fire that kept everyone alive could take the whole house. And with homes built close together along a village street, possibly take the neighbours' houses with it, in the time it took anyone to wake up and smell what was happening. Medieval communities took that risk seriously enough to write a law around it, and that law is still sitting inside a word you use today without ever thinking about where it came from. Each night, a bell rang across the village or the manor, and at that signal, households were required to bank their fires, rake the coals down flat, smother the open flame, and cover the embers in ash so they would smoulder low and safe until morning instead of burning free while everyone in the house was unconscious a few feet away. In French, that instruction was couvre-feu, cover the fire. Some households even kept a dedicated fireguard for the job, a domed cover of terracotta or metal set directly over the coals to choke the flame down for the night. That French phrase crossed into English almost unchanged. It's where curfew comes from, and the original curfew had nothing to do with keeping people off the streets after dark. It was a nightly mandatory ritual for keeping a house full of sleeping people from burning alive in the one structure they had no fast way to escape. During the one season, they had no way to survive without that same fire. That was the trade every peasant household made, every night for months at a stretch. The fire that kept the frost out was also the single greatest threat under the roof, and the only real defense anyone had against it was a bell, a shovel of ash, and the discipline to bank the coals before closing your eyes. Bodo's account book doesn't tell us whether he ever lay awake listening for that bell, or whether by his 10th winter it was as automatic as locking a door is to us now. What the record does tell us is that the family made it through, season after season, on pottage and rationed pork, and the borrowed warmth of animals through a wall in a house that was, by any modern standard, quietly working to kill them two different ways at once. Freeze if the fire went out, burn if it didn't. They didn't call any of this survival, they called it winter. The same 5 or 6 months that came every year and had to be gotten through the same way as the last one, on the same pottage, under the same wool, next to the same fire that was never fully trusted and never fully avoidable either. What stands out looking back at a household like Bodo's isn't one clever invention that solved the cold. It's how much of staying alive came down to small, repeated discipline instead. A bell rung on schedule, a shovel of ash, a fire fed just enough and banked down every single night without exception for an entire lifetime, in a house with no chimney and nowhere else to go. There was no single fix for winter. There was only the routine done correctly night after night for as long as the cold lasted. So the next time you turn a thermostat down before bed without a second thought, it's worth asking what the medieval version of that habit actually cost someone to get right, and how many households didn't. If a season like that makes you want to see how other hardships got survived without any of the tools we take for granted, now there's more of that waiting in the rest of this channel.